Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Scott Schell and I'm an independent scholar formerly associated with the University of California, Berkeley. I'm a specialist in the Germanic languages and I have a bachelor's degree in German, a master's degree in linguistics, and a PhD in Germanic linguistics. And so today what I wanted to do was go ahead and bring you part 2 of Germanic versus Scandinavian and the politics surrounding the word Germanic. So a couple weeks ago I went ahead and did part 1 on the politics of Germanic versus Scandinavian, and I talked about, the Nordic R and really its political motivations to even suggest the Nordic R, also the political motivations to suggest something like Proto-Nordic or Proto-Scandinavian. After that video, a good friend of mine here, Dr. Michael Fragomeni, went ahead and gave me a call and we talked about the video a little bit. He said, well, Scott, there's a lot more going on outside of just language and identity. And, you really could talk about X, Y, and Z regarding some of the general ideas of what was going on with the politics between Germany and the rest of Scandinavia. And I said, well, I'm not a historian, right? I specialized in linguistics, but I do have an idea. Why don't we get you to come on the channel and, since you're an expert in history, arguably, right?
Well, one could argue.
Then why don't you come on and why don't you go ahead and talk about that a little bit for us, that regarding the political situation between Germany and Scandinavia. So I'll go ahead and let Mike or Dr. Fragomeni go ahead and introduce himself, talk about his background a little bit, and just go ahead and go from there.
Well, like you, I graduated from University of California, Berkeley with a PhD in Germanic linguistics. Also got my master's in Germanic linguistics, and but I got my BA in history, and then switched fields. The Holy Roman Empire is really where this whole thing starts. We even have to go back a little further than that, which is the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, or I should say the Western Roman Empire. And then, of course, that begins the medieval period. One of the main things that happened around that time was the emergence of the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic tribe, and they turned out to be the most powerful tribe. And they wound up making a deal with the Catholic Church. They were Christianized, and they went around converting all of the other Germanic tribes to Christianity, to their form of Christianity, the Roman Catholic version of Christianity. And the last tribe to hold out and hold on to their pagan beliefs were the Saxons, which is the language that you've been discussing in your videos. And eventually the Saxons were conquered by Charlemagne, who was the leader of the Franks, and more or less as a reward, I'm definitely skipping over a lot of details, he was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800, actually on Christmas Day, 800 AD. So that's the beginning of the end for pagan Germanic. Practically the whole continent now was converted to Christianity, and the old pagan beliefs, this question, it's called the German question, right? Mm-hmm. What is it to be German? Right. That's the theme of this whole thing. What is it to be German?
Because even back then, the concept of German was pretty foreign, right? You had all these different tribes.
You had tribes, and then, of course, you had the principalities, and you had the city-states, and all of it was controlled by the church. All of it was controlled by the Pope. You had an emperor and a pope, and at times they would fight, they would disagree. Other times they would get along fine. And this lasted 1,000 years, with the Habsburgs eventually taking over control of the Holy Roman Empire. In around the 1500s, 16th century, the next major development is the Reformation of the Church. So at this point, we have the Protestant religions emerging. And this creates a conflict primarily between North and South. And we're talking on the continent now. The North winds up wanting to break away from the church. This is where Lutheranism is and all of the other Protestant faiths. Whereas the South wants to stay with the church at this point. And the end result really is a war, of course. There were the wars of religion, but the 30 Years' War. Yeah. And this is the first real conflict between Scandinavia and what we would call continental Germany, like the area of Germany. Sweden fights in this war, Denmark fights in this war, France fights in this war. It's a devastating war. The people who suffer the most are the German citizens, because most of the battles are fought what would be modern day Germany, right? And so it's a devastating war. There's starvation, there's rape and pillage and all that other stuff. And the end result is that they just decide that North can be Protestant and South can stay with the Catholic Church. So nothing got accomplished, as usual, right? But what this did was this created a division where in the North, so northern Germany, but also Denmark and Norway and Sweden, had much more autonomy when it came to studying. Or the academic world. They were more like England, being protected from the continent by the English Channel. So they had freedom to study and adopt what's called, the scientific method, right? So we get into the 1600s and we have what's called the scientific revolution. So Scandinavia benefits from this, and we see that historically, that a lot of the scientific discoveries that were made at this time were made in Scandinavian countries as well as England, countries that had the freedom to conduct experiments and do things without the church looking over their shoulder, right? This continues on into the time of Frederick the Great, right? So now we're in the 18th century, and people say, okay, Frederick the Great, why was he so great? Well, he was the leader of Prussia, but Prussia was emerging as the most powerful of all the German city-states, okay, or provinces, you want to say, and it's primarily because of their military. We say, okay, well, Prussia's in the north. They must have benefited from this scientific revolution. Well, kind of and kind of not. Frederick the Great was an absolute monarch. He ruled by decree, and he did not really embrace German culture. So when we go back to this question of what is it to be German, I'm German. Okay, what does that mean? You speak German. What is it to be German?
And so that's probably, just to add to that probably ties into the whole language and identity later.
Yeah, exactly. That's
their identity to be able to say this is German, so I'm German. That's
it, and that's where this is all headed. But to use Frederick the Great as an example, he despised German. He said he only spoke German to his horse. Right. He identified with France and French culture. During this whole period, the only group that hung on to the old German folklore and the old German traditions were the peasants. Anyone who had higher status than that considered that old medieval stuff to be sort of what we would consider in America to be sort of, backwards thinking or
country bumpkin.
Country bumpkin sort of stuff. And so the prestige was to not embrace that, was to distance oneself from that stuff. Eventually, what winds up happening is Napoleon, the French Revolution takes place, and Napoleon conquers all of Europe. And as part of the scientific revolution, there's the emergence of what's called the Enlightenment, right? We're not going to get into what the Enlightenment was, but
it's a whole different video.
Hopefully we know.
Maybe a whole different video series.
What the Enlightenment was, but it went hand in hand with the scientific revolution, and And so Napoleon, though he was a military dictator, he embraced the Enlightenment, and he felt that France was sort of the caretaker of the Enlightenment and was going to bring it to all of the other European countries. If they accepted it willingly, great. Otherwise, they would accept it at the end of a bayonet. And this is essentially what happened, was that the Germans who were occupied by the French pushed back on this. And this pushback is ultimately what we call Romanticism. And this was the first sort of movement to get back to the old medieval ways, you know, as a sense of pride, as a way of standing up against French occupation.
Can I ask you a question real quick? Do you think this is also part of the reason Grimm, so Jacob and Wilhelm, they both went around collecting the fairy tales?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second. So what winds up happening is one of the main things that Napoleon does is he ends the Holy Roman Empire. He says that this is the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Now he proclaims himself to be emperor, but this is the end of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. And it lasted roughly, it's about 1800, maybe 1803 that he does this, so it roughly lasts about 1,000 years. And he also, at the time, there were all of these little principalities and little city-states, over 300 of them, that comprised what we would call Germany, right? Germany wasn't unified. Germany wasn't a country. What he did was he brought bureaucracy to these city-states and these principalities, and he combined a lot of them. And so ultimately, what were over 300 city-states were reduced to about 39, I think his number was. And the German people didn't like this, and the nobles didn't like this. If you were a prince, and even if you just lived in a little castle and you had a little village around you, and that was basically your little city-state, you wanted to keep that. And then all of a sudden that's taken away from you, and now you have to answer to a governor. You still get to keep your title, but you don't really reign over anything, right? So there was a pushback on that level too. There was a peace conference called the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and the great powers, which were England and Russia and Prussia and Austria, met, and they decided how Europe was going to be carved up. This always happens after major wars. Like, let's carve things up. And representatives came from the German city-states, and what they wanted was a unified Germany. They were tired of going back to the 30 Years' War. They were tired of being occupied, divided. It's this whole divide and conquer that if they were unified, they would be strong and they could stand up to something. If something like Napoleon were to happen again, they could stand up to it. And they were refused. The great powers did not want a unified Germany. They were afraid. They felt like Austria was a good balance to France, and they didn't want a unified Germany tipping the scales. And this created problems. There was a whole movement in the 18-teens where young revolutionaries were fighting for German unification. And this is where the Brothers Grimm come in.
Okay.
The interest in linguistics and collecting fairy tales comes into play. Because once again, how can these people request unification if they don't even know what they are? Well, what are you unifying over?
Right.
Like, you have to answer that question first. So the Brothers
gave them a chance to unify under language and identity.
Right.
And
is it religion?
Okay.
Is it skin color? Is it like it? It could be a number of things, right? Well, the two competing, whatchamacallit, like the two competing ideas, we could say, were the Klein Deutschland and the Groß Deutschland, which is just little Germany and big Germany, or we could say lesser Germany and greater Germany is really a better translation. And Klein Deutschland, the people who were fighting for that, that's more like Brothers Grimm. What they were trying to do was they were saying the answer to the German question is its language first and foremost, and then it's these fairy tales, it's tradition, and it's our mythology, you could even say. And the lesser German idea wanted to keep Austria out. That's why it's the smaller Germany, because they didn't want, it's not that they didn't want the Austrians, they didn't want the rest of the old Holy Roman Empire, which included the Balkans, okay, which is Slavic people, and these are people who, the advocates for the lesser Germany did not want these un-German people included in their country. They felt like that was not, they didn't want, it's like today's, situation with immigration, like they didn't want these people. The Großdeutschland group wanted Austria because they felt like it would make for a stronger unified Germany, and they were willing to include all of these other ethnicities into this country. So these were the competing ideas at the time, and this is the time of Rasmus Rask and Jakob Grimm and the discovery, and Wilhelm, and the discovery of what we call the first sound shift, which becomes Grimm's Law, which is really based on Rask's work.
It is. It's based on Rask's work. It's just that Grimm basically created the typologies.
The revolutionaries, they're called the Turnverein, which is just the turner, which is the gymnast. This idea that you had to be physically fit, you had to be ready to fight, like the ultimate soldier. All of this stuff was going on in the 1820s into the 1830s. But then it died off, and there wasn't really much movement. Germany did not become a unified country. But it heated up again in 1848. There's what's called the Revolution of 1848. It's a failed revolution. And at this time, now we have the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx. We have upper middle class bourgeois status. These are businessmen, bankers, merchants, and then we also have the artisan class. And the artisan class is more like the working class. And these groups are not really enjoying these absolute monarchies that they're living under because it's hurting them. And they all have different reasons for wanting a revolution. They don't really agree on much. They can't even agree on Kleindeutschland versus Großdeutschland, but they do agree that they want to overthrow the monarchies. So that's what starts the revolution. And of course it doesn't last long, because usually left of center can't really see eye to eye. They're all fighting for different things. And what winds up happening is the revolution fails. The last holdout, if I remember correctly, is in Baden. I'm pretty sure it's in Baden. And the worry was that if the revolution succeeded, it would, like dominoes, start taking hold in all the other German city-states. So the Prussians wind up sending their army. The Prussians have the strongest army on the continent. And once the Prussian army is released, that's the end of it. The Prussians just quash the whole thing. The aftermath of this is that, especially in Prussia, there is this feeling of, unified Germany would actually be a good thing, as long as we control it. As long as we can maintain an absolute monarchy, we would like to have all of Germany united. And it's not until the 1860s when Bismarck becomes the prime minister, chancellor of...
That's Otto von Bismarck, right?
Yeah, Otto von Bismarck, and he's also general, he's leader of the military. And what he does was he instigates 3 wars in quick succession. 1864 against Denmark, Schleswig-Holstein.
Yeah.
And then
That's actually really important too, the whole Schleswig-Holstein thing.
Yeah.
And Otto von Bismarck, and even it ties back nicely again to the first part of this video where I'm talking about the Horn of Gallius.
Right.
Because they were, the Germans and the Scandinavians were fighting over, is this horn actually German or is this horn actually Scandinavian?
Right.
And, historically, from a broader perspective, like you're saying, that whole area of Schleswig-Holstein has been fought over consistently.
Yes.
And so that runic object was almost like a piece of evidence to say, no, that's actually German.
That's right. That's right. And so it's very political at this point in time. This is the 1860s now. The American Civil War is taking place. There's a civil war / revolution going on in Italy at the same time. Italy winds up as a unified country after the 1860s. So this is a time of revolution and civil war. And so the war against Denmark was an easy victory for Prussia. They got the Austrians to join up with them, and Austria agreed to be their ally. Austria didn't really even do anything in the war. The Prussians didn't need them. It was more of a political move. 2 years later, Bismarck instigates a war against Austria, puts them in their place, and then in 1870 he goes to war with France, which is the Franco-Prussian War, and that's the biggest one of them all because Prussia defeated what they considered to be at the time a great power in France, and the Prussians defeated them pretty handily. So in this fervor of victory, military victory, conquest, it winds up galvanizing the whole country, all of the German city-states, and they all want to unify, all for the wrong reason, right? They wind up unifying as the Klein Deutschland.
Okay.
Right. So this is the beginning of the Second Reich, right? The First Reich is the Holy Roman Empire. Now it's the Second Reich. And Germany, this unified Germany, 1871, winds up becoming an extremely powerful country. They industrialize rapidly. Within just a few short years, they're rivaling the United States and Great Britain as becoming the most industrialized nation. But they're also very progressive. It's the first country where unions are allowed to be formed. They have health care. There's all kinds of things that you would never think would be going on in this authoritarian, German empire. Bismarck was a genius when it came to balancing Germany to avoid war, to avoid a great war. He said that you always wanted to be in a majority of 3 of the 5 great powers. You never wanted to find yourself in a minority of 2. And he was able to pull that off until he was pushed out by Wilhelm II. When the new Kaiser took over, he basically did away with all of Bismarck's, all the stuff that Bismarck had established. And the biggest mistake he made was he decided that he wanted to build a huge navy. Of course, the British didn't like that, and the end result was World War I. Of course, there's a lot more to this. Sure, yeah. World War I is 5 more videos, or easily, So, but the point here is that it's at the end of the 19th century when this feeling of Deutschland über alles, or this whole, the German people are the strongest, and we should tell the rest of Europe what should be going on. This all starts in pre-World War I. This is not Nazi stuff. Right? These aren't Nazis, but there is this feeling of German superiority. Right. And so, whereas in the early 19th century, one could almost sympathize with the German cause.
Before World War I, and then, of course, World War II.
Yeah, in the early 1800s, after the Congress of Vienna.
Because in a sense, they were a people just looking for their identity.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so that's where one could say, like, if you're reading through the history, you're like, you can sympathize with the Germans at that point, the German people, wanting to unify, wanting to find their identity, rediscover their identity. By the end of the century, however, they found it, and they were using it as a way to sort of dominate and bully. We could say that they were becoming the bullies of Europe from a military standpoint. And it's because they united under the Prussian flag. Right. They didn't unite for these greater causes like the Revolution of 1848. They unified under war, under the banner of war and
That's
conquest, you know. So of course, you know, the Germans lose World War I, and that gives rise to the Nazis. And to go all the way back to what you were talking about when you were in the seminar, and you said you studied Germanic and the other students rolled their eyes.
Oh yeah.
It's primarily because of World War II.
Of course.
Yeah. And you know, and it's because...
But it really built up to that point, right? There were issues obviously before then.
Right.
But then once World War II happened, they were just kind of like, yeah, we're not going to even entertain the idea of Germanic anything.
Yeah.
Really. You know.
Well, it's because the Nazis hijacked all of it. And
Yeah.
they used it for their, you know, political gain.
Motivations and stuff.
They hijacked the runes, they hijacked the fairy tales, they hijacked philosophers, and twisted it and turned it into something that
would fit their ideology.
Exactly, right. And so, which is, you know, not a good thing. Nazis are not good. But the thing is that it's always important to know the history. It's important to know how a country gets to a certain point, or how a people get to a certain point. What brings them to that precipice, you know? And that's what I wanted to talk about in this video, was to just sort of shed light on some of the historical events that took place in the 1,000 years leading up to, or more than 1,000 years leading up to the Second Reich, and then of course that's taken apart after World War I, and then we see the rise of the Third Reich under the Nazis.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just to continue with the whole ideology thing, the whole Nazi ideology thing, I mean, it is, you know, it is unfortunate that I can't, you know, walk around with a rune, for example, you know, without being questioned, you know, and say, you know, are you tied to Nazi ideology? And it's like, no, I'm just into like runology and linguistics and, you know, heathen type of stuff. And, you know, it's so, you know, more politics and, you know,
well,
unfortunate.
It's just, you know, it's just, as there are so many unfortunate things that came out of World War II, it's just yet another one of these very unfortunate things for the German people and for German culture in general. Yeah. That, you know, you can't, it's you know, you take a class and you want to study something and you have to condition it. Yeah. By saying, well, I'm not really, it's like, I'm not really into this, and it's unfortunate. That's all I can say. So.
Well, all right. Well, is that all you had for us today? I mean, it was quite a bit.
Yeah.
No, I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much more to talk about, but you know, your videos are on the shorter side, so you know, it's.
Well, we could maybe do another one in the future.
Yeah.
You know. If it works out.
If there's a situation where there's a need to zoom in more on something, you know, maybe we could do that. You know.
All right.
So.
Well, everyone, thanks for watching, and I hope you got quite a bit out of this video. As always, please go ahead and subscribe, like the video, and leave any comments below. I'm sure Dr. Fragomeni here is going to be looking at the comment section as well, so he could chime in and maybe answer some of your guys' questions.
Sure.
And I'll talk to you all soon. Take care. Ortoris os reda condeva unia agel nos isen I pen el honso tir berca